This is a somewhat unique moment for those who don't see progress on this conflict, where now we are at a point where nearly all Arab states support a two-state solution.
There is talk of another ceasefire in the offing, hostage releases in return for aid, reportedly backed by guarantees from Trump himself.
I think the thing, as we all know, with President Trump is this unpredictability. He can be part of the solution, he can exacerbate the problem. It depends on the day.
Hello, and welcome to Independent Thinking, the podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. We're talking about Gaza today. It has faced devastating losses in this latest phase of the war, on top of all the conflict that followed the Hamas-led attacks on October the 7th in 2023. According to the Ministry of Health in Gaza, more than 50,000 Palestinians have been killed and more than 100,000 injured since that date. Israel launched its military campaign in response to those Hamas attacks, which killed around 1,200 people and led to more than 240 hostages being taken. Israel says its latest operations are aimed at dismantling Hamas infrastructure and leadership, but the intensity of the fighting has caused even more civilian casualties and destruction across Gaza. For more than 11 weeks, Gaza has faced a strict Israeli blockade that's made it incredibly difficult for people to access food, clean water, or medical care. Aid agencies are now warning of famine-like conditions and continue to call for greater humanitarian access. Today we're talking about three central questions. First, what are the internal political dynamics driving this conflict? What is Prime Minister Netanyahu aiming to achieve? Second, are President Trump's efforts helping or hindering the search for a resolution to this conflict? And third, what vision do the regional powers have for Gaza's future? Joining me today are Yossi Mekelberg and Stephen Farrell, both from Chatham House, and Dr. Julie Norman from the University College London, who's just written a book on Gaza. Welcome to you all. Yossi, let me start with you. To what extent is Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's Gaza strategy being driven by internal political pressures?
Very much so. And what Netanyahu is trying to do is doing for quite a long time, is hijacking the agenda and creating a new narrative about what happened on 7th of October and since then. As we speak, he's facing a corruption trial. He gives evidence. Next week, starting the cross-examination, which is the thing that he look for least in this trial. In order to derail his corruption trial, he needs to stay in power, and in order to stay in power, he needs to appease the most right-wing elements within his government. And they keep telling him that unless they continue the war in Gaza, actually expand it, pushing Palestinians, 2 million of them, to a very small part of Gaza in the south, they will leave the coalition, and he can't afford it. So now they're building all the new narrative about defeating Hamas, which hasn't happened for 19 months, and the other thing, that only military pressure would lead to the release of the hostages, that so far we've seen exactly the opposite, that only diplomatic efforts led to the release of hostages. And as a result of that, we see also more protests in Israel. But this, I think, unless there is pressure from the outside, we see some of it mounting right now, this is the direction that Netanyahu will take Israel in this war.
You've answered one of my questions about the new narrative that he and his cabinet colleagues are putting out there. Just perhaps spell out for us why he feels he needs to stay in power to hold these corruption charges at bay. Because, as you said, the trial is going on at the moment. This is 3 sets of corruption charges. Why does staying in power help him?
Because it helps him to water down the democratic system in Israel, to attack the gatekeepers of the democratic system, appointing the kind of people, whether it's the Attorney General in Shabak, in the military. He would like also the judges that will be most comfortable to him, whether it's in case he is convicted, if there is an appeal and there is a case of a custodial sentence, also to reduce it or even to get immunity. That's the discussion even before October 7. Now, under any normal circumstances, a prime minister that presided of the biggest failure in Israel history, security history, as was the case in October 7, would have resigned almost immediately. But the nexus between the corruption trial is hunger for political survival. Corruption led him to adhere and try to stay in power by any cost. But when I say any cost, it's any cost to the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Some have accused Netanyahu of prolonging the war in order to keep at bay 3 sets of corruption charges against him. He denies those corruption allegations and denies that motivation. Julie, let me pick up the central point that Yossi is making about this question of Netanyahu's military strategy, defeating Hamas by force. Has it been a consistent strategy, or is it a shifting one?
Well, I would say in many ways it has been consistent. It's what Netanyahu has been saying since the beginning of the war, despite the fact that many of his own military and security advisors have recognized that a complete military defeat of Hamas is really impossible and very unlikely, and that the cost for both Palestinians and as well as for Israeli soldiers and Israeli society to perpetuate the war is not going to match up with that goal. I would say in these recent days, this renewal of a new potential ground offensive, of a potential reoccupation, and again, doubling down on this goal that has for the last year and a half proven unachievable in the way that Netanyahu seems to be pushing for it to be. There's very little militarily additional that can be done to wipe out Hamas, aside from what I think Netanyahu sees as ultimate pressure to get Hamas to surrender and lay down their arms, which is something that the group has not been willing to do.
Steve, before joining us as head of news and comment, you were covering this conflict intensively for many years, including most recently as Reuters bureau chief in Jerusalem. What do you think of Netanyahu's stated goal of eliminating Hamas by military action? Is it achievable?
To degrade them, yes. To get rid of many of their fighters, yes. To kill the leadership, yes. But you can't kill an idea. You can't kill an ideology. Hamas is the expression of Palestinian nationalism, if you like, one particular expression expressed in a particularly Islamist way, in a way that, committed this horrifying attack on October the 7th. But even if their own people lose the faith in Hamas, an Israeli leader is not going to eradicate the concept of Palestinian nationalism within Palestinians. So military victory, what does that even mean?
You've written a book on Hamas, updated recently as events demanded, and many of the people you described are pictured in those pages now dead. When you see those pictures of hostages being handed over, many Hamas people appearing in uniform, what does it tell you about the persistent strength of Hamas in Gaza?
I think I would have to caveat that with nobody really knows how strong Hamas is in Gaza, at least nobody outside an intelligence service with vastly more superior monitoring equipment than we would have access to, not least because as international journalists have not been permitted into Gaza. So the situation on the ground is very murky. Can they provide enough fighters to, if you like, to donut in media terms, put a ring of fighters around somebody being let out? Yes, they can. But it's also clear that they're still able to pop out of their holes and carry out attacks. There's still some sort of military capability there. Yahya Sinwar, one of the architects behind the October 7th operation, who I met in Gaza the day after he was released from an Israeli prison, he clearly had confidence that he could lead Hamas to a great new era. I think that was hugely misplaced in the sense of his plan, aside from all the appalling civilian casualties that have been drawn into it on the Israeli side, on the Palestinian side, has seen a massive amount of destruction wrought on his own troops. But what does this generation of young Palestinians and the next generation, what are they going to think going forward? How many recruits do we think have been created? How much anger has been generated against Israel by the scale of Israel's attack on Gaza, something that I'm guessing Sinwar knew would come and knew would create future supporters for Palestinian nationalism, if not for Hamas specifically.
Julie, just on that point, anger against Israel, anger against Hamas itself, where do you think Palestinians under this sustained assault and all the difficulties of life, where do you think their feelings are, as much as we can know?
Yeah, well, again, it's certainly as much as we can know, but I would say in all directions. I mean, obviously, extreme. I don't think there's even words that can describe the emotions towards Israel, towards the assault, and what people have suffered and are still suffering. But much anger towards Hamas as well, and I think that is perhaps underappreciated. We've seen some images of protests, even those are still pretty rare. When we look at polling, when we talk to people on the ground, a lot of frustration with Hamas even before October 7th, and then certainly in this last year and a half. That's most in Gaza. I would say Hamas has probably gained some support in the West Bank, but within Gaza, where people are living this war, dying from this war, the anger is directed there as well. And I think it just underscores the sense that most civilians in Gaza are so hungry for a different type of leadership, for a new Palestinian leadership that rejects Hamas, rejects the old way of doing things, and really can start something new. But right now, that ideal just seems still so far away. And in the meantime, people feel very, very stuck in this current reality where Hamas is the only game in town. And I would say Netanyahu has prevented any vision, any plan for any other kind of viable leadership to be able to take place. And that was before the war, and it's certainly the case now with looking for any kind of so-called day after arrangement or plan.
We'll come on to some of those day after points. But Yossi, what about the opinion within Israel? You've got reservists, some of them are sounding less keen on taking part in military action than in the past. You've got the hostage families still immensely distraught. You've got a very, very vocal right wing seeing this as a chance to advance their goals. What can we say about opinion within Israel?
I think from this conversation, we hear that basically the public, whether it's Palestinian or Israeli, fed up with their leadership because they don't provide what we expect of leadership to provide, security in any sense and well-being. And the same goes for Israel. When talking about reservists, there are some reservists that already in the last 19 months served more than 400 days in reserve. And they keep being called, kind of the old order before 7th of October, you will be called for 30 days, maximum 40 days. They will call in one go of 75 days. It means that they're leaving their families for a very long time. They are leaving their businesses, students, their studies. So more and more of them are resentful, especially there is no end in sight.
And it is showing up in the economic figures, that kind of disruption to people's jobs and businesses and so on.
Yeah, but it also shows that if at the beginning of the war, there was more than 100% of soldiers showing up, meaning even those who were not called on October 7th to join their units, just showed up and said, we are here, we want to join the war. Now we are talking about roughly 50% that show up. And this is one of the things that the army and the government don't want to dwell, because this is kind of inconvenient truth. But less and less, which means at the same time that the burden of serving in the army is on less and less people, at the same time that there is legislation going on in the Knesset to exempt ultra-Orthodox from serving in reserve. And so the burden, not only the military service, but also the economic, those who generate wealth within society, are roughly the same, and it's smaller and smaller a group within the Israeli population. And that's by nature create resentment. Put on top of it that 70% of Israelis says that they prefer a ceasefire that see the return of the hostages than continuing the war. And most of them also in opinion polls express their wish to see a different government.
So we'll come on to that. And there is indeed an election due next year. I just want to draw this first section to a close. This podcast is about Gaza, but we should note what is happening on the West Bank, which is constant incursions by settlers against Palestinians and Bedouin on the West Bank. I just want to ask all of you to come back to this first question about Netanyahu's goals. We dealt with the corruption point, wants to stay in government, and all that. But what do we now know about the goals of his government in terms of trying to take over Gaza, trying to control Gaza, trying to take more of the West Bank? What is it possible to say with some firmness? Steve, what's your view?
Netanyahu, of course, is very clear about what he says he is trying to achieve with the current military operation. He wants to get back Israel's hostages. He wants to ensure Israel's communities around Gaza never again have to face the kind of thing that they saw on October the 7th. And he wants, he says, to destroy Hamas as a military force and as a force that could possibly govern Gaza in any future scenario. In his first term, Trump gave Netanyahu so much, recognized Israel's claim to Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, effectively an open hand that Netanyahu must be hoping that he can continue that role going and either de facto or outright annex the West Bank, which is, for his right-wing coalition parties, the original Jewish heartland, the Judea and Samaria. Whether Gaza, of course, seems a security threat, but Judea and Samaria is so core, and within that, East Jerusalem is the Temple Mount. All of that is wrapped up for his coalition. That's what they want. And that's what he will hope to give them. Now, Trump may not be so accommodating this time round, partly, I suspect, because he feels he gave Netanyahu a lot in his first term, and he's going to want to see something back in this term, I suspect, and that's going to be he doesn't want another war, making him look weak in the same way I'm sure he would see it as the chaos in Afghanistan made Biden look weak. So what he wants and what he may get, different things.
Okay, so let's use that as a point to move on and talk about our second question, which is Trump. Yossi, what do you make of what Steve has just been describing about Netanyahu's hopes, which he's pushing at, of more indulgence, if you like, under President Trump, who, of course, has floated very controversial ideas like the expulsion of Palestinians. He's talked of Gaza as something of a beachside real estate opportunity and the rest of it. Has that, in your view, changed the aims of the Netanyahu government?
I think the thing, as we all know, with President Trump is this unpredictability. So he can be part of the solution, he can exacerbate the problem. It depends on the day. When he talks about building a Riviera, but without Palestinians, which basically is advancing a case of committing war crimes, of expelling more than 2 million people from their homes, or what left of their homes, then he suggests something which goes against international humanitarian law. On the same time, we hear that also he's getting fed up with Netanyahu's intransigence. In his idea, you can solve conflicts very quickly just because the President of the United States says so, which we all know it's not the case, neither here nor in Ukraine. And he also, it seems that definitely during his visit in the Gulf, he was attentive to some of the things that he heard there, that the humanitarian situation is impossible, and the other thing, how it affects stability and U.S. interest in the Gulf. So the question is he going to do something about it? We saw on the eve of his inauguration, the pressure from the United States led to a ceasefire, led to a deal with three-phase one, but we never crossed or passed the first phase. Can we return there and accelerate it? This is the real test for Trump. I think what happens in Israel, and definitely with Netanyahu, they look at it with, quite cautiously, because the one entity in the world that they will listen to is Donald Trump.
Donald Trump made a visit very recently to the Gulf. It seemed to result in much tougher language from him towards Israel. They seem to have bent his ear on their view of this particular conflict. Is that, in your view, a significant factor? Should Netanyahu recalculate?
I think there's certainly a sense of getting the cold shoulder from Trump in Israel. And I can see where that comes from, skipping the visit to Israel while he was in the region, also some recent policy decisions in the region. But I want to say it shouldn't be overstated either. Trump has been very clear. He does want the war to end. He'll say that rhetorically. But when it actually comes down to putting any kind of pressure on Netanyahu, on Israel to do that, the Trump administration has been very reluctant to do that. And I would say, if anything, the fact that Trump has been relatively hands-off on Gaza has essentially given Netanyahu a green light to do exactly what we see this week with, with the reoccupation, with relaunching an offensive. Certainly, there are still mediation efforts going on in the background. We've been hearing different kind of reports from those this week, but I think where we have to see where facts really are, and what we actually see on the ground is the U.S. assisting Israel in this new aid regime, bringing in this new sort of distribution system that leapfrogs over the UN and other humanitarian actors. So in many ways, even though Trump is not embracing Israel in the way that I think Netanyahu expected him to, on the ground and in terms of what Israel wants to do, Trump is essentially leaving the door wide open for that to happen.
Just on that new US-led humanitarian distribution body, which has been very controversial, what is your take on it?
So I would say it's rightly very controversial, and we've already seen several resignations from top-level individuals who agreed with many of the humanitarian assessments that this body cannot deliver aid in the way that we would expect in terms of aid being impartial, aid not being used for political or military incentives and purposes, as well as just simple logistics on the ground of reducing almost 400 distribution sites to 4, having them all concentrated in one geographic area that by necessity forces people to yet again be displaced, leaves people who are injured, disabled, which again is a massive number right now in Gaza, unable to reach that aid. I mean, again, more importantly, though, just goes along with essentially helping Israel with this next phase of the war, and again using aid as part of that policy. So I think it's rightly controversial, and it's not surprising that many actors have been reluctant to take part in it.
And Steve, what about other pressure from outside on this whole situation, particularly on Israel? Perhaps emboldened by President Trump sounding a little bit tougher towards Israel, you had the leaders of Canada, the UK, France saying enough to Israel about Gaza and warning of escalating sanctions. Is that real pressure, or is it just really in the sort of the wing of the US?
Well, it's not real pressure yet. I mean, saying is one thing, doing is another. And I think if saying were going to stop Benjamin Netanyahu, then the tens of thousands of Israelis turning out on the streets, potential voters who've been turning out on the streets for however many years against him, has not swayed him in what he intends to do. So I doubt very much that Keir Starmer or the Canadians will do so. I mean, he came out and firmly rebuffed them and said they were on the wrong side of justice and so forth. I think one thing that is looming on the horizon and that I think will be interesting is that in the middle of next month, in the middle of June, we see a conference in New York, co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia, which is going to try and put pressure on Israel by advocating that more countries recognize the state of Palestine. And the conference it's called Peaceful Settlement of the Question of Palestine and Implementation of the Two-State Solution. I mean, lots of words in there that Benjamin Netanyahu would not want to see implemented, or his right-wing allies. But if we start to see big hitters from the West actively turning up to a conference like that, or countries like the UK, like France, like others, really putting their shoulder behind recognition, that will be proper diplomatic pressure. And it'll be interesting to see what happens at that conference.
So let's go on and talk about our third question, which is the region's vision for Gaza. And it's been easy to say for years that the region needs to solve this, but the region is indeed coming up with plans. First called the Egyptian plan, then there was the Arab plan, then, as Steve has been describing, various conferences working with other interested parties, including in Europe. Yosi, does this seem new to you? Does it feel new?
There are some new elements in this, but the original Saudi and then the Beirut Declaration Plan of 2002 was all the ingredients were there already of peace between the Israelis and Palestinians in return for normalization. And this is the thing that could have and should have probably been back then. And this was the height of the second Intifada. I think in between, people fell into the idea of status quo and conflict management that, of course, came to haunt all of us on 7th of October. Now there is a sense of urgency whether it's in the region but also outside, as Steve described, because there is I think the international community internalizes that at the end of the day, without resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there will be an outbreak of violence, and even worse and worse outbreak of violence. It affects the interest of all countries involved in the region, but also in Europe, in beyond. It enters into the discourse in other societies. It affects economic interests. It's radicalized not only in the region, but also beyond the region. So there is, I think for the first time for a long time, a sense of urgency. And I think in this sense, the conference that Steve mentioned earlier is important because all of a sudden, the issue of recognition of Palestinian statehood is on the table. And this is one of the issues that Israel fears most, but it's become more and more inevitable.
Julie, what difference does recognition of a Palestinian state mean? There's always pressure on the UK government to say, recognize this state now. If a Palestinian state at the moment, part of it is lying in rubble and the other part is losing territory apparently by the day.
Yes, I mean, obviously, this idea of recognition has been on the table for a while. The UK government has always said, when it's appropriate, when it will be useful is the best time to do it. And I think the question is if we are approaching that time now, especially if France and other states make that move this summer. And why it matters, there are different opinions on it, but essentially I would say, helps sort of freeze at least the territorial questions that we currently see. I mean, as we're looking at potential reoccupation of Gaza, a gradual chipping away at the West Bank, recognition of a Palestinian state does, I think, push back a little bit at that ability to keep annexing different parts of that state when multiple members, the majority members of the international community, recognize that state as being Palestinian. Moreover, though, it also makes sure that a two-state solution is the beginning rather than the end point of future peace processes, negotiations, settlements, and sets that out to establish even a bit more equal playing field for going into negotiations and for, I would say, just keeping these states like Europe, like the US, that have pushed for a two-state solution. It keeps them honest to it, saying if this is actually our policy to seek an Israeli-Palestinian state next to each other, we need to make sure that our policies are in line with that and not supporting perhaps Israeli policies that are chipping away and making that more and more impossible. So there's symbolic reasons, but I think there's pragmatic reasons too for negotiation that at some time, they seem very far away now, but at some time will happen again.
Steve, do you think the Saudis have influence on this? I mean, they've been saying for a long time they want normalization with Israel, saying, look, could be the gateway to all kinds of relations with wider Muslim populations in Indonesia and far beyond the region. But they've been adamant that there must be some proper commitment to a Palestinian state. Has this got urgency, momentum, reality behind it, or is it words at this point?
Are they serious? Yes, I think they are serious. Do they have influence? Absolutely. I mean, we've discussed this before. Don't forget, in 2002, it was a Saudi peace plan that was being presented to the Arab League. They were sitting down in Beirut discussing it. And at the moment they were, Hamas blew up a Passover Seder in Israel in order to wreck that deal. When on October the 7th, itself, on the day, Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas leader, came out and said, this is a message to those who would normalize. Hamas is on the ground. We are going to stop this. One thing that has happened is I can't see Hamas now being a factor in anybody's considerations. They helped to spike it in 2002. Whatever other motivations lay behind them on October the 7th, normalization and stopping it was behind them. I don't think anybody's paying attention now to what Hamas wants. If the Saudis want it and they are able to persuade a transactional Trump that it's in his interests, and the Europeans, for whatever public pressure reasons mounting upon them with daily scenes on television, that even the Israelis are beginning to see, I think, domestic appreciation. This looks not good for Israel. I think you may well have a possible moment here.
Just taking us right back to the beginning of this whole conversation, I'm very struck by what you just said then, that no one is paying attention to Hamas, and yet we've described at the top of this about how Hamas is just not gone, the only game in town, and so on. Julie, what do you think of the ability of the region, including that Egypt and Jordan and so on, to describe a future leadership of Palestinians that doesn't include Hamas?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say is this is a somewhat unique moment for those who don't see progress on this conflict, where now we are at a point where nearly all Arab states support a two-state solution, are wanting to work towards a resolution here. Most states have no interest in working with Hamas. They see them as a problem. They see them as a spoiler. So I think most regional states are, in line with that vision of having a new type of Palestinian leadership and are willing to work very hard to make that happen, whether that's through technocratic support, political support, economic support, what have you, to rebuild a new kind of Gaza that just Hamas does not have the same type of power and influence that it's had in the past. But you need something to be able to come in and fill that space that Hamas has occupied. And right now, again, Netanyahu has essentially blocked that kind of ability. What I would say right now for Hamas, they are a resistance movement. They are very savvy about being a very effective guerrilla movement in Gaza in particular. And all they need to do essentially is not surrender to say they are succeeding. And so I think there will always be an element of Hamas. I think there will always be some element of resistance, but the key here is trying to find some kind of space for a viable alternative, which, as we've discussed before, most people are very hungry for and most people are very willing to accept, but there needs to be a space for that to happen.
And Yossi, let me give the last word to you. Does this conversation we're just having right now about moves in the region to describe a future deal, a future Palestinian leadership, does that have any purchase at all on the discussion within Israel?
I think right now most Israelis will want to see the war comes to an end. And it's interesting how those two parallel conversation before the rest of the regions that move to completely different direction. For instance, when I talk about Hamas, it's an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is outlawed in other countries in the region and only recently in Jordan. So the conversation is to move beyond this extreme movement. But they also represent something which is authentic. It's the protest of the inability to provide, again, security and welfare in the society. And now it's moved also to Israel, because the conversation with Israel is getting more and more extreme, and the agenda is becoming extreme. And you mentioned earlier election. It looks around the corner, but 13 months under these conditions is eternity. And until we can see a change, it will take some time and probably very toxic election campaign.
Well, we will come on to those things, the election campaign, many other things we've touched on fleetingly, including Egypt, Jordan, Iran and Syria, where our Middle East program is doing a lot of work at the moment. And I really do urge you to look at our website on that. And also on the laws of war. And here I would love your comments in response to this podcast. Something we're looking into a lot and something I was debating with Jeremy Corbyn, Yanis Varoufakis, Malcolm Rifkind at the weekend about when a country has broken laws of war, and our earlier discussion in this about whether Israel has credible military purpose, whether it's getting anywhere, is one aspect of those judgments. We are going to have to stop there. So many, many thanks to my guests. Many thanks to you for listening. Our producer this week was Amanda Nunn. I'm Bronwen Maddox. Goodbye for now.